Every legal question is governed by a rule. And how we go about answering that legal question just sort of depends on the kind of rule that governs that question. So let's look at some examples here. Let's say that this box is our legal question, and our question is whether someone has committed a battery. A battery. You've probably heard of battery before. It's often in the expression assault and battery. But there's actually a very specific legal rule that governs battery, that tells us whether someone has committed a battery. And whether someone has committed battery is governed by a three-part test. There are three things we have to consider to determine whether someone has committed a battery. One, was there contact with the victim? Was there physical contact, unwanted contact, at least on the part of the victim? Okay, and was that contact intentional? Did the defendant intentionally cause that contact? And then finally, did that contact result in some sort of harm or injury to the victim? All right, now we call these three parts of the test, the three considerations, we call these elements. These are the elements of the rule that governs battery. All right, now notice that I said that there has to be contact, and that contact has to be intentional, and the intentional contact has to cause a harm. Right? So we need all of these elements to satisfy this rule. We have to have contact and intent and harm to constitute battery. Now, if all of the elements are necessary, if all of the elements must be established like this to satisfy the test, then we say that the elements are in the conjunctive. In the conjunctive. And we call this a conjunctive elements test. All right, and we know that they're in the conjunctive because of this keyword "and" here. That tells us that to establish battery, we have to have element 1 and element 2 and element 3. So let's indicate that all three are necessary by drawing a solid line here to each one of the elements. All right, so that's how you determine the answer to a legal question if the question is governed by a conjunctive elements test. All right, let's take a look at another example. Let's look at another example. Let's say this example is also a three-part test, and our question this time is what is legally considered a person? Okay, sometimes the law will say that a person can't do this or can do that, but what do you have to be a person? Do you have to be a human being, or can you be something else? Okay, and let's say that in our jurisdiction, the definition of person includes natural person, of course, okay, but it also includes corporations and any other organizations, okay, even if they're unincorporated. So here again we have an elements test. These are the elements of our person rule. Okay, these are the elements of the test for determining whether someone or something is a person. But notice that this time I said to be a person you have to be a natural person or a corporation or an organization. That means that only one of these elements needs to be satisfied to satisfy this overall person test. To be a person, you don't have to be a natural person and a corporation and an organization. I'm not even sure if that's possible. Okay? You only have to be one of these things. Now, if only one of the elements needs to be established to satisfy the test, we say that the elements are in the disjunctive. These are disjunctive elements, and we call this a disjunctive elements test. And we know that because of this keyword "or" here. The "or" tells us that only one of these elements needs to be satisfied to satisfy the test. So let's indicate that only one element needs to be established by drawing dashed lines to each of the elements. Let's say that the dashed lines mean that you only have to establish one of these three elements to satisfy this overall test. All right, so far we have a conjunctive elements test and a disjunctive elements test. Let's look at one more type of rule that can govern a legal question. All right, so let me scroll up here just a little bit. And let's look at another three-part test. And let's say that the test this time is to help us determine whether it's reasonable for a landlord to not fix a defect on his property. All right, so I'll just write, is it reasonable? Is it reasonable for a landlord to leave some defect unrepaired? And the way we determine whether it's reasonable, because normally you would think that a landlord would fix fix some defects on his property, but maybe there are some that he would just want to leave alone. The way we determine whether he has a legal obligation to fix that defect is to consider three things. What is the probability that that defect is going to result in an injury? And secondly, if there is an injury, how severe will that injury be? And then finally, what is the burden on the landlord of fixing that defect? Okay, so the probability is how likely an injury will occur. The severity is considering, well, if there is an injury, how severe will it be? And then burden is evaluating, how difficult will it be to actually make this fix? Is it really hard to get to it? Will it take a long time, a lot of money? These are all things that we would need to consider to determine whether it's legally okay to leave a defect unfixed. Is it reasonable for the landlord to leave that defect unfixed? Now, notice that these considerations are a little bit different than the elements we saw up above. Okay, the elements that we looked at previously, these are kind of like on-off switches. It's either satisfied or it's not. Either there's contact or there's no contact. Either the contact results in a harm or it doesn't result in a harm. Okay, and an entity is either a corporation or it's not a corporation. So these elements are either satisfied or not satisfied. But these are a little bit different. These considerations down here are not elements. We call these considerations factors. You'll notice that you can't really turn these on or off. Okay, the probability factor is not asking whether there is a probability or is there not a probability of injury. There's always a probability, even if that probability is 0. All right, so what this factor asks us to consider is how much of a probability is there? Is it very likely? Is it just sort of likely? Or is it very unlikely? Same thing with severity. If there is an injury, would it be probably a very minor injury, or would it be extremely severe? And then burden is also a range. It could be, there's always some burden, right? You have to, at least move to fix something. So is it a very minor burden, or would it be extremely, extremely expensive and time-consuming to make this repair? So to determine whether a landlord would be reasonable in not fixing a defect, we need to consider all of these things. We consider all of these things, but we consider them all together. We weigh them together. Okay? And because we weigh all of these together, we look at each one individually first, and we see what the probability is, what the severity would be, and what the burden would be, but then we consider them all together on the whole to determine whether it would be reasonable for the landlord to leave that defect unfixed. Now, because we balance all of these together, we sometimes call these factors, or these factor tests, balancing tests. So let me write that down here. Because the factors are all considered, and then they are balanced all together to determine if, on the whole, it would be reasonable to leave that defect unrepaired. Okay, so let's indicate that by drawing sort of a bracket around all the factors. Okay, so this will indicate that we have to consider all the factors, but we consider them all together. We weigh them. We look at the probability, we look at the severity, and we look at the overall burden. So for example here, let's say that the probability of an injury is extremely high. Well, that alone would seem to suggest that, that landlord should probably fix it. But even if there is an injury, if the severity is extremely low, and let's say that at most, even if there is an injury, you'll get a hangnail, and the burden is very, very high. It'll cost $1 million to fix it. Well, then even though there's a high probability of injury, on balance, it's probably reasonable to say that the landlord doesn't need to fix that. Okay, so this is how we do a balancing test. This is how you answer a legal question if the question is governed by a balancing test. All right, so we've got the 3 different types of rules that can govern legal questions. These are the 3 types. Now, these 3 types can actually be all combined. So let's take a look at an example of that. All right, let's say that now our question is whether someone has committed reckless driving. So we want to know whether someone has committed reckless driving. And let's say that reckless driving is governed by a 3-part test. And the 3 things we have to consider are whether the person was in a designated driving area. Okay. You have to be in a particular area to be convicted of, or to be guilty of reckless driving. And, you have to be driving a car. Okay, no matter how recklessly you're riding your bike, you won't be convicted of reckless driving. And then finally, you have to be operating that car with something that we call wanton disregard for the safety of others. Wanton disregard. Now, that just means that you're being extremely careless and you're not considering at all the safety of others in the way that you're driving your car. All right, now, in order to be found guilty of reckless driving, you must be in a specifically designated driving area, okay, a recognized driving area under the law. You have to be driving a car, and you have to be driving that car with wanton disregard. Now, notice I said that you have to be in a driving area, and you have to be driving a car, and operating that car with wanton disregard. So what is this? This is a conjunctive elements test. We need all of these elements to be established to satisfy reckless driving. Okay, so let's draw our solid lines here to remind us that we have to satisfy all of these elements to establish reckless driving. All right, but we can do more. Let's say that the driving areas, those designated driving areas, those include a public road, and they also include parking lots. Okay, so you are in a designated driving area if you are on a road or if you're in a parking lot. So either one of these would satisfy this driving area element. Okay, so notice that to figure out whether this element is satisfied, it has its own elements test. And let's indicate that this is a disjunctive elements test because of the or here by drawing our dashed lines. So let's see what's going on. We have a rule that has three parts to it, three elements, and one of these elements has two elements of its own. To satisfy this element, we have to satisfy either the road element or the parking lot element. Now, a car is just a car, but let's see about this wanton disregard. And let's say wanton disregard is governed by its own three-part test. And the three considerations for whether someone is operating a car with wanton disregard is to see the manner in which the person is driving. Okay, how fast you're going, are you weaving in and out of lanes? The potential victims around, okay, so the people who are around who might be injured. I'll just say people around. And then the driving conditions. Are they perfect driving conditions, smooth road, sunny day, or is it very icy? Is it pouring rain? Is it dark outside? Is the road very bumpy and gravelly? Okay, so these are the three considerations. Now we need to consider all of these things to determine whether someone is driving with wanton disregard. Okay, wanton disregard requires us to evaluate all of these factors. These are factors. We're going to evaluate all these factors and determine if, on the whole, a person is operating the vehicle with wanton disregard. So let's indicate that with our little brackets here. Okay, so let's walk through this using an example. Let's say that a person is driving down the highway at 100 miles an hour, weaving in and out of lanes. Okay, but it's in the middle of the day. The driving conditions are perfect, and there really aren't that many people around. Okay, it's not rush hour or anything like that. Okay, so let's walk through all of these elements. In order to establish reckless driving, we know that you have to be in a designated driving area, and you have to be driving a car, and you have to be driving with wanton disregard. Now, we said that the person was driving on a highway, so that's a road. So this element is satisfied. Now, the person is not driving in a parking lot, okay, because we said that he was on the highway. But because only one of these elements needs to be satisfied, the driving area, the designated driving area element is satisfied, because we only needed to have the person on a road or in a parking lot, not both. And we've got the person on a road, so this driving area element is satisfied. Now we said that he was driving in a car, so this element is also satisfied. And now let's look at wanton disregard. Okay. Now let's actually start on this end here. We said that it was a very sunny day. The road was smooth. It was clear. It's been recently paved. It's a straight road. Okay. So the conditions would actually not indicate that there was wanton disregard. Okay. If anything, the driving conditions are just fine. Okay, so this would not cut in favor of saying that the person was operating the car with wanton disregard. It was the middle of the day. It wasn't rush hour. There really weren't that many people around either. I mean, there were some people. Okay, but this wouldn't really indicate wanton disregard either. All right, now we get to this factor, the manner factor. We said that he was weaving in between lanes and going 100 miles an hour. Okay, so that definitely weighs in favor of wanton disregard. And he's going 100 miles an hour. I mean, that really weighs in favor of wanton disregard. Not to mention the weaving in and out of traffic. So even though two of the factors would seem to cut in favor of saying that, he's driving okay, the manner in which he's driving, that factor alone, when we weigh these all together, which is what we have to do in a balancing test, the manner would seem to suggest that this person was operating the car with wanton disregard. So this element is also satisfied. And now because the driving area element and the car element and the wanton disregard element, all three are established, we can say that this person is guilty of reckless driving. So this is how we answer a legal question using the different types of rules that govern the legal issues.